By the summer of 1940, Britain stood almost entirely alone. Western Europe had collapsed with astonishing speed. Denmark and Norway fell in April. The Germans swept into the Low Countries in May. France, despite desperate Anglo-French cooperation, capitulated in June. With the evacuation from Dunkirk complete, Britain had saved around 338,000 men, but most heavy equipment had been abandoned on the beaches. For the first time since the threat of Napoleon, invasion felt possible, and in Whitehall, the fear was quietly acknowledged in every corridor of the Air Ministry. Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, that was now the shield upon which Britain's survival depended. At its heart lay a delicate system: aircraft production, radar warning, observer corps spotting, sector stations controlling squadrons in the air, and, at the base of it all, the ground crews who kept the fighters serviceable. In theory, every damaged aircraft was to be sent to specialized maintenance units for repair. In practice, the scale and tempo of German attacks made such procedures impossible. The Luftwaffe, confident after its success in France, believed Britain could be crushed by destroying the RAF in southern England. From airfields in the Pas-de-Calais and the Cherbourg Peninsula, German bombers and fighters now reached British airspace within minutes. Daily raids targeted ports, radar masts, and increasingly fighter commands forward airfields. Hawkinge, Manston, Tangmere, Biggin Hill, North Weald, and Debden all found themselves under near constant assault. When a squadron returned from combat, it often carried wounds far worse than official reports suggested. Armourers preparing ammunition belts might find cannon bays splintered by shrapnel. Riggers opening inspection panels discovered severed control wires or torn hydraulic lines. Fitters checking Merlin engines detected shockloads, coolant leaks, or cracked manifolds. On paper, many of these faults fell into the category of Category B damaged aircraft that should be removed from service until proper structural or mechanical repair could be undertaken. But, during the height of the Battle of Britain, with squadrons sometimes losing several aircraft a day, formal procedures met the blunt reality of necessity. Ground crew, many of them barely out of technical training schools at Helton or St. Athan, suddenly found themselves improvising solutions far beyond what the manuals allowed. Some repairs were officially discouraged, others were strictly forbidden, yet the alternative, leaving fighters idle while the Luftwaffe swept overhead, was unthinkable. The British system of dispersal pens, often constructed from sandbags or earth revetments, offered some protection, but not enough. Many airfields suffered direct hits on workshops or stores, destroying spare parts. Fitters began to salvage usable sections from wrecks dragged in from the edges of the field. Undercarriage legs, ailerons, exhaust stubs, ammunition trays, anything intact was cleaned, measured, and fitted. In several squadrons, a single worn Merlin engine cannibalized from a crash-landed aircraft kept 3 others flying by, supplying essential components. Radar and intelligence reports helped Fighter Command anticipate enemy movements, but the rhythm of combat left almost no margin. Aircraft often had to be turned around in 20 or 30 minutes between sorties. Armourers topped up ammunition drums while engines were still running. Riggers inspected fabric control surfaces under the roar of Merlins being warmed for takeoff. Fuel bowsers moved in long, exposed lines across open fields at a time when German reconnaissance flights circled overhead seeking targets. It was within this pressured environment that forbidden repairs emerged, not as acts of recklessness but as expressions of British ingenuity under conditions of extreme strain. The Air Ministry understood the risks yet looked away, so long as aircraft returned to service and squadrons stayed operational. Dowding's quiet policy of decentralization gave local station commanders the latitude to allow such work when absolutely necessary. By early August, German attacks on sector stations intensified. Biggin Hill and Manston suffered repeated damage. Workshop roofs were blown off, tool sheds destroyed, supply chains severed, but the ground crews adapted. Improvised jigs were built using bomb crates. Damaged wing spars were reinforced with metal plating sourced from scrap yards behind the station. When certain adhesives ran short, riggers mixed stand-in compounds from stores normally used for fabric doping. Nothing about this was in the training syllabus, yet everything was vital. These were not dramatic acts of battlefield heroism. No medals were awarded for them, but the survival of Fighter Command depended upon men who worked largely unseen, men whose decisions, made with judgment rather than regulation, ensured that damaged aircraft returned to the sky when they were needed most. And as the Luftwaffe prepared for the next phase of its campaign, the strain on these crews would only deepen, setting the stage for remarkable acts of skill, improvisation, and resolve that would become emblematic of Britain's endurance. As August deepened, the German strategy shifted again. What began as probing attacks on shipping in the Channel had evolved into a systematic effort to break Fighter Command's defensive network. The Luftwaffe's High Command under Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring believed that destroying Britain's fighter strength on the ground was the surest path to achieving air superiority. This misjudgment would ultimately shape the character of the Battle of Britain, but in the moment it placed immense pressure on the RAF's ground infrastructure. Fighter stations across the south and southeast operated at the limits of endurance. Many airfields were built before the war, intended for peacetime flying with well-spaced hangars and orderly repair bays. The sudden reality of high-intensity warfare exposed the vulnerability of these sites. Official reports filed to the Air Ministry in August 1940 recorded everything from bomb craters interrupting taxiways to shattered lighting systems and fuel mains ripped open by near misses. Each of these minor disruptions had a compounding effect on the ground crews tasked with maintaining operational tempo. Complicating matters further was the patchwork nature of aircraft production and repair. Britain's aircraft industry was immense yet fragile, dependent on hundreds of subcontractors and dispersed factories. Replacement parts did arrive, but rarely in the quantities or combinations required. A squadron might receive 2 new elevators but no rudder, a shipment of tires but not enough inner tubes, crates of windscreen panels but no armor plates. The result was a perpetual tension between official maintenance requirements and the practical need to keep fighters serviceable. To manage this strain, many stations reorganized their workflow. Fitters, riggers, electricians, armourers, and instrument specialists were grouped into rapid response teams, capable of performing essential triage on incoming aircraft. Each role was disciplined and technically defined, yet the boundaries between them blurred as the crisis deepened. Electricians found themselves repairing hydraulic lines, riggers worked side by side with engine fitters, armourers improvised metal patching techniques learned from civilian trades. The urgency of the moment required adaptability far beyond conventional training. Much of this improvisation occurred under direct threat. Luftwaffe raids seldom struck once. Airfields were often attacked repeatedly throughout the day, with bombs targeting dispersal, pens, fuel dumps, and workshop areas. Ground crews had to continue working even as sirens sounded, deciding instinctively whether to take shelter or press on. Many chose to stay with the aircraft. Testimonies collected by the Imperial War Museum described men lying flat under fuselages as bombs fell nearby, shielding themselves behind landing gear and fuel tanks. When the outclear sounded, they rose, dusted themselves off, and resumed repairs. Morale was strained but resilient. The rhythm of work, relentless though it was, gave structure to days otherwise defined by uncertainty. Mess rooms became brief sanctuaries for tea, bread, and moments of quiet. Letters from home, pinned inside toolboxes, reminded many of what was at stake. And though ground crew rarely saw combat directly, they felt its weight each time a pilot climbed into a cockpit. Many developed unspoken rituals. A tap on the wing before takeoff, a short wave at dispersal, or a hand on the propeller spinner for luck. These gestures, simple yet sincere, encapsulated the human connection binding airmen and those who kept them flying. Crucially, the RAF's command structure recognized that victory depended not only on aircraft numbers but on the speed with which they could be returned to service. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group, bore the brunt of the assault and repeatedly emphasized the need for rapid turnaround. Every sortie mattered. Every fighter in the air contributed to maintaining the fragile balance of defense. In this environment, regulations that demanded lengthy inspections or formal removal of damaged aircraft were quietly overridden by station commanders who trusted their crew's judgment. By late August, the pace of battle accelerated. German fighter bombers struck at communications centers and fuel reserves. Sector operations rooms endured direct hits. Biggin Hill's control rooms were smashed twice within days. Yet ground crews worked through smoke and debris to restore communications, equipment, and repair battered fighters. At Manston, aircraft were forced to land amid craters and unexploded bombs, while ground personnel operated without functioning hangars. That was amid this lived reality, one of danger, scarcity, and unbroken determination, that the phenomenon of forbidden repairs became not simply commonplace but essential. These were decisions made quietly, far from the strategic debates of Whitehall. A cracked spar reinforced with improvised plating, a damaged coolant pipe sealed with a clamp never approved in the manuals, a landing gear actuator cannibalist from the remnants of a wreck. Each act represented a small but vital triumph of British resourcefulness. Yet these remarkable efforts did more than keep aircraft flying. They preserved the operational heartbeat of fighter command at a moment when Britain's fate hung in the balance. The ground crew's choices, shaped by necessity, guided by skill, and carried out with quiet resolve, formed the unseen foundation upon which the coming turning point would rest. The ground crews of fighter command. We've lived close to the conflict yet were almost invisible. Within its official records, they slept in Nissen huts on the periphery of airfields, often within earshot of bombing raids that shook the thin corrugated walls. Their work began before dawn, long before pilots arrived for morning briefings, and often continued deep into the night by the muted glow of shaded lamps designed to evade German reconnaissance aircraft. Though seldom acknowledged publicly, these men bore a psychological burden distinct from those who fought in the air. They knew every aircraft intimately, every panel, every control line, every vibration of the Merlin engines they coaxed back to life. When a pilot failed to return, the loss was felt not in abstraction but through the empty dispersal stand they had prepared at dawn. Several crews recorded the silent act of clearing a pilot's gear, helmet, gloves, maps still laid out, beside a machine that would never again take to the air. Their resilience came from routine and camaraderie. Tea served hastily from battered urns, cigarettes shared in the lee of a sandbag wall, the clatter of tools placed back into a roll at the end of a shift. These small rituals became anchors in a world of uncertainty. Yet beneath the quiet routines lay a profound understanding. The work they carried out, often unseen, directly influenced who lived and who died in the skies above southern England. It was this blend of duty, the skill, and unspoken emotional gravity that shaped the ground crew's remarkable commitment, enabling them to push the limits of what was considered permissible in aircraft maintenance. In tactical terms, Fighter Command's survival depended upon its ability to keep aircraft airborne faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Each squadron operated a tightly managed cycle of sorties that left little room for error. Pilots returned from combat with minutes to spare before the next scramble order was issued. During these windows, ground crews became the decisive factor in Britain's defensive capability. The Luftwaffe's strategy aimed directly at disrupting this rhythm by attacking airfields, communications lines, and fuel storage areas. German commanders sought to fracture Fighter Command's infrastructure. Yet even under bombardment, British ground crews restored critical systems with astonishing speed. Reports from Biggin Hill describe electrical teams repairing shattered lines while smoke still drifted through the station offices. At North Weald, fitters moved aircraft through cratered taxiways in zigzag patterns, improvised minutes beforehand. Turnaround time became a tactical weapon in itself. A fighter refueled, rearmed, and repaired in 20 minutes could rejoin the fray before German raiders completed their second run. In doing so, it maintained pressure on the Luftwaffe's own overextended operations. Each improvised repair, a patched coolant leak, a reinforced panel, a hastily replaced tire contributed to this rhythm of resistance. What emerged was a battlefield defined not only by aerial duels, but by a silent contest of maintenance and endurance. The Luftwaffe sought to exhaust British capacity. The ground crews countered through speed, innovation, and a disciplined calm in the face of constant threat. Through this lens, their forbidden repairs were not merely acts of improvisation, but tactical responses that materially affected the outcome of daily engagements over Britain. The engineering complexity of the Spitfire and Hurricane placed extraordinary demands on maintenance personnel. Both aircraft were products of 1930s innovation, elegant, fast, and aerodynamically advanced, but they were also delicate machines that required precise handling. Wartime pressures, however, forced a departure from ideal procedures. Technical manuals produced by the Air Ministry outlined strict guidelines for structural, mechanical, and electrical repairs. Some tasks required specialist jigs, others demanded parts that were simply unavailable in sufficient quantity. When airfields were bombed and stores destroyed, these requirements became impossible to meet. Ground crews responded by applying principles learned from civilian trades, metalworking techniques from automotive workshops, carpentry skills from pre-war apprenticeships, and electrical knowledge honed in factories or power stations. Improvisation did not imply carelessness. On the contrary, many crews approached these unofficial repairs with intense precision. A cracked exhaust manifold might be welded using portable oxyacetylene kits scavenged from civilian workshops. Damaged control cables could be rethreaded using wire rope typically reserved for non-aviation purposes. Wingskins torn by cannon fire were patched with aluminium sheets salvaged from wrecked enemy aircraft, a detail noted in several station logs. Crucially, these repairs were always assessed against a simple criterion: would the aircraft survive its next sortie? Station engineering officers walked a narrow line between regulation and necessity, exercising disciplined judgment to approve only those repairs deemed structurally sound. It was engineering conducted under pressure, with lives at stake, and it demonstrated a level of ingenuity that would later influence broader RAF maintenance doctrine. Leadership, during the Battle of Britain, required a balance between adherence to doctrine and acceptance of difficult compromises. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding understood that the RAF's defensive system, the Dowding system, relied as much on the resilience of ground operations as on radar or pilot skill. Yet he also knew that insisting upon strict maintenance standards would cripple his squadron's ability to sustain combat. Station commanders therefore found themselves exercising unusual autonomy. Many issued quiet guidance rather than formal orders. If an aircraft could be made airworthy and safe for a single sortie, it was to be returned to service. Engineering officers, normally guardians of regulation, were encouraged to use their judgment in assessing non-standard repairs. This subtle shift in authority created a culture where innovation flourished within disciplined boundaries. Communication between leadership and the rank-and-file was equally crucial. Daily briefings held in makeshift rooms, sometimes damaged by bombing, outlined incoming intelligence, expected attack windows, and anticipated sortie rates. These sessions often featured blunt acknowledgments of shortages, limited spares, damaged hangars, or exhausted crews. What mattered was transparency. Ground personnel responded with renewed commitment when they understood the stakes, doubting strategic restraint, combined with Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's operational decisiveness, allowed Fighter Command to sustain pressure on the Luftwaffe despite mounting losses. Their leadership approach, decentralized, pragmatic, and quietly confident, created the conditions in which forbidden repairs became not only tolerated but essential to the wider defense of Britain. Behind every improvised repair lay a moral calculation. Ground crews understood that a misjudged fix could cost a pilot's life. Yet they also recognized that leaving a damaged fighter grounded might cost the lives of many others. This tension between individual safety and collective necessity shaped an ethical environment unique to wartime aviation. Most crews were deeply protective of the aircraft they maintained and the pilots who flew them. Many knew the airmen personally. They shared meals, stories, and the same thin margin between normality and tragedy. Approving a repair that fell outside regulations required courage of a different kind, not the courage to fight, but the courage to shoulder responsibility quietly. Station engineering officers bore the heaviest burden. Their signatures authorized repairs that, in peacetime, would have been rejected outright. These officers did not make such decisions lightly. Logs from several sector stations note instances where aircraft were kept grounded despite pressure to return them to service. Decisions taken to preserve a pilot's life even when operational need was acute. This moral landscape, subtle, complex, and often invisible, defined the character of RAF maintenance culture. It revealed a form of courage rooted not in dramatic heroism but in measured judgment, and it was this ethical steadiness, maintained even under the strain of invasion threat, that preserved the integrity of Fighter Command's defense. Strategically, the ability to keep aircraft flying became one of Britain's most powerful assets. The Luftwaffe assumed that sustained bombing would degrade the RAF's operational strength faster than it could be rebuilt. However, British improvisation at the ground level disrupted this calculus. Every fighter restored through unofficial methods represented a strategic denial, a refusal to concede air superiority. The British aircraft industry, though stretched, provided a steady stream of new fighters, but it was the ground crews who translated industrial output into daily combat strength. Their work ensured that the RAF's numbers remained deceptively stable even during periods of intense attrition. German intelligence, relying on incomplete reconnaissance reports, consistently underestimated Britain's capacity to regenerate its fighter force. This misperception shaped the broader trajectory of the battle. Believing the RAF close to collapse, the Luftwaffe intensified its assaults, inadvertently reinforcing British resolve. Meanwhile, ground crews, using every resource at hand, sustained sortie rates that kept Fighter Command viable. In this way, maintenance became a strategic function, not merely a technical duty, but a coordinated effort that influenced the pace, direction, and eventual outcome of Germany's air campaign. Every patched aircraft, every salvaged component, contributed to a national defense effort in which speed and ingenuity were as decisive as firepower. Early September 1940 marked the height of the Luftwaffe's assault on southern England. Fighter Command's airfields, already battered through August, faced an intensification of raids as German strategy shifted to breaking Britain's defensive network by weight of numbers. Among the hardest hit was RAF Hawkinge, a forward landing ground perched on the cliffs above Folkestone, operating at the very edge of No. 11 Group's defensive line. On the 7th of September, as German bombers swept inland to strike London, Hawkinge came under sustained attack. Bombs fell across dispersal areas, gouging deep craters in the chalky soil. Workshops lost roofs, fuel bowsers burned fiercely, communication lines ran dead across the station. Yet the airfield remained operational, its ground crews working in choking dust and smoke as fighters landed, refueled, and returned to the air in rapid succession. Amid this turbulence, one incident came to symbolize the precarious balance between regulation and necessity. A Supermarine Spitfire from a frontline squadron marked by hours of intense combat returned to Hawkinge just after midday. It landed hard, veering sideways as its undercarriage absorbed the impact. When the aircraft rolled to a halt, ground crew rushed forward, expecting to perform standard turnaround checks. Instead, they found significant structural damage. The starboard undercarriage support assembly had cracked at the pivot point, a failure that normally required immediate grounding and removal to a maintenance unit. The engineering officer on duty faced a stark dilemma. The squadron was already down to half its operational complement. Radar reports indicated fresh raids forming over the Pas-de-Calais, expected to cross the coast within the hour. Every available fighter would be needed, yet the damage before him was not minor. If the pivot failed during landing, the aircraft could collapse on touchdown, endangering both the pilot and the dispersal team. The technical manual left no ambiguity. Such a failure rendered the aircraft unserviceable, but this was not peacetime. Bombs were still falling nearby, and two other fighters were already being patched with temporary repairs. The officer understood that grounding the aircraft might leave the squadron incapable of meeting its next scramble order. What followed was a demonstration of British engineering judgment pushed to its extreme. The ground crews set about dismantling the damaged assembly using hand tools, as power supplies had been disrupted by the earlier blast. The cracked component could not be replaced. Spares had been destroyed in a burning store's hut the previous week. Instead, the crew examined wreckage brought in from the perimeter, a Hurricane that had crash-landed days before. Its undercarriage housing differed from the Spitfire's design, but the steel reinforcing plates showed potential. Working against both time and regulation, the riggers and fitters removed a section of hardened steel from the Hurricane's remains. Using portable vices clamped to a surviving workbench, they shaped the plate to fit the Spitfire's pivot support. The engineering officer supervised every stage, checking alignment by eye and by improvised strategies fashioned from damaged cowling panels. Welding was the greatest challenge. The station's primary welding kit had been destroyed earlier in the morning. Only a small oxyacetylene set remained, its cylinders half empty. The metal worker tasked with the job, a former automotive welder from Birmingham, prepared the surface, heating the plate slowly to avoid warping. Bombs continued to fall in the distance, but no one moved from their position. With painstaking care, he fused the plate to the cracked housing, reinforcing the area with additional weld beads to distribute stress loads that it was, in every respect, a forbidden repair. The Air Ministry would not have sanctioned it. No formal documentation existed for such a modification, and its durability beyond a single flight was uncertain. Yet the quality of the craftsmanship, precise, measured, and informed by years of practical experience, gave the engineering officer enough confidence to proceed. Once cooled, the assembly was reinstalled. The pilot, briefed on the nature of the repair, accepted the risk without hesitation. With the engine running and the propeller wash scattering dust across the dispersal area, the aircraft taxied carefully to the end of the damaged runway. Ground crew watched in silence. If the repair failed, the consequences would be immediate and catastrophic. The Spitfire accelerated, its tail rising as it gathered speed. For a moment, as it hit a shallow rut, the starboard leg appeared to flex, but the reinforcement held. The aircraft lifted cleanly into the air, banking towards the Thames estuary where incoming raids were forming. Within minutes, the squadron joined the battle over London. The repaired Spitfire flew to full sorties that afternoon. Its pilot later reported no significant vibration or instability during maneuvers, a quiet testament to the skill of the men who had refused to let the machine be grounded. This moment, though small in scale, carried profound consequences. By maintaining its sortie strength at a critical juncture, the squadron helped reinforce a wider defensive effort against the first major daylight assault on the capital. The ability of Hawkinge's ground crew to improvise under bombardment ensured that Fighter Command retained the marginal advantage needed to contest the sky during one of the most pivotal days of the campaign. And as daylight faded, the reinforced Spitfire returned once more, its undercarriage locking into place without fault, the unofficial welds holding firm in quiet defiance of the pressures of war. The events at Hawkinge on the 7th of September did not occur in isolation. Across southern England, similar scenes unfolded as ground crews pushed the boundaries of wartime engineering to keep Fighter Command operational. The improvised repair on the Spitfire's undercarriage became emblematic of a broader pattern. Dozens of small, unofficial decisions that, collectively, sustained Britain's air defense at its most fragile moment. In the hours that followed the first attack on London, raids continued with devastating intensity. Fires spread along the docks and warehouses of the East End, and plumes of smoke drifted over the Thames. No 11 Group, directed from Uxbridge's underground operations room, scrambled every available squadron. Airfields such as Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch operated under conditions that barely resembled viable military bases. Power lines down, telephone exchanges damaged, and crews working around scattered debris. It was here that the impact of that forbidden repair became clearer. Squadrons could only function as an integrated whole. If even a single aircraft was grounded, the formation lost flexibility. A pilot might have to fly without his usual wingman. A patrol might launch weaker. A section might be split. But when each station managed to keep one or two additional fighters in the air, the ones that should have been withdrawn by regulation, the cumulative effect became strategically significant. Reports from Fighter Command's daily operations logs show that, on several occasions, the difference between a full-strength and reduced-strength patrol amounted to just 2 or 3 fighters. In such circumstances, the unofficial repairs performed at Hawkinge and elsewhere effectively maintained the equilibrium of the air battle. The Luftwaffe encountered formations that appeared, from their perspective, unexpectedly resilient. During the late afternoon of the 7th of September, this resilience became critical. With London burning and the civilian toll rising, Fighter Command launched a concentrated counter-effort to disrupt the second wave of German bombers. Among those scrambled was the squadron from Hawkinge, including the Spitfire repaired only hours earlier. Radar plots tracked the incoming formations as they crossed the coast at Dungeness. The Luftwaffe believed they faced weakened opposition. Their intelligence assessments, based on reconnaissance photography and assumptions about British repair capabilities, underestimated the RAF's operational readiness. The presence of even a handful of additional fighters altered the tactical calculus. More aircraft meant more interception lines, greater pressure on bomber formations, and increased disruption to German targeting accuracy. The repaired Spitfire joined its squadron over the mouth of the Thames. The pilot, flying with the confidence of one who trusted the men who had rebuilt his aircraft under impossible conditions, reported later that the machine responded cleanly. It climbed without hesitation, banked steadily, and held its speed during the dive toward the bomber stream. In this engagement, every British aircraft mattered. The Luftwaffe's Heinkel and Dornier bombers, already scattered by earlier interceptions, were forced to break formation repeatedly as RAF fighters pressed their attacks, even when not scoring hits. The presence of an additional fighter increased the psychological and tactical pressure on the enemy crews. Bomber gunners divided their fire, formations lost coherence, accuracy diminished. It is impossible to attribute the outcome of such a vast engagement to a single repaired aircraft, yet it is historically accurate that the RAF's ability to field a new operational force on the 7th of September forced the Luftwaffe into a prolonged combat environment that strained their own resources and morale. German post-action reports noted persistent fighter opposition and unexpected presence of additional patrols, observations that aligned with the British experience of strained yet sustained readiness. As dusk approached, the fighting tapered. The sky turned a muted orange, veiled with smoke drifting from London's docks. One by one, British fighters returned to their makeshift airfields. The Spitfire from Hawkinge landed without incident, its improvised undercarriage reinforcement holding through a second harsh landing on a runway pitted with craters. Ground crew met the aircraft with expressions of relief that barely concealed exhaustion. They checked the welds, ran their hands over the reinforcement plate, and inspected the landing gear for stress fractures. Despite the extremes of the day, the structure remained intact. The aircraft was refueled, rearmed, and prepared for the next morning. A quiet confirmation of the skill and judgment that had defied official regulation but upheld operational necessity. Word of the repair spread informally among engineering officers across No. 11 Group. Not informal reports. Such actions remained outside the boundaries of documented procedure, but through the conversations and shared experience of wartime service, the practical lesson was clear. When official channels failed under the strain of continuous attack, the expertise of ground personnel could bridge the gap. In the days that followed, as the Luftwaffe shifted focus toward wider raids on London, Fighter Command maintained its strength with surprising consistency. The improvised repairs at multiple stations, including Hawkinge, became an unspoken pillar of this endurance. The Luftwaffe's expectation that the RAF would collapse under sustained pressure never materialized. Instead, Britain's defensive capacity stabilized, not because conditions improved, but because ingenuity compensated for scarcity. The turning point of the battle was not defined solely by the shift in German strategy or the resilience of British pilots. It hinged also on the decisions made on dispersal grounds, workshop floors, and bomb-scarred fields where ground crews welded, patched, reinforced, and improvised repairs that allowed the RAF to remain in the fight. And so, when the next critical phase of the campaign emerged, the Luftwaffe's transition from airfield attacks to the sustained bombing of cities, Fighter Command remained intact, bloodied yet functional, ready for the decisive weeks ahead. This quiet strength, forged through unofficial craftsmanship and disciplined risk, became one of the decisive elements that preserved Britain's air defense at its moment of greatest peril. In the immediate aftermath of the events of the 7th of September, Hawkinge remained a study in contrasts, a place battered by war yet sustained by determination. The airfield was littered with fragments of corrugated roofing, spent cartridge cases, and the twisted remains of fuel barrels. Craters scarred the taxi. The smell of burnt timber and spilled petrol lingered in the cool evening air. Yet in the midst of this destruction, the station retained a sense of controlled purpose. The repaired Spitfire stood silently in its dispersal bay, its metal surfaces reflecting the last traces of daylight. To an uninformed observer, it would have appeared no different from any other aircraft in the squadron. Only those who had worked on it, who had bent steel, salvaged from wreckage, who had welded by hand under bombardment, who had judged the risks with sober clarity, understood the significance of what it had achieved. Their unofficial craftsmanship had extended far beyond a single source. It had contributed to the RAF's ability to meet the Luftwaffe's largest daylight assault to date. In the hours that followed, Fighter Command's operations rooms compiled their assessments. Reports streamed in from sector stations, detailing losses, repairs, fuel consumption, and serviceable aircraft counts. Despite the ferocity of the day's attacks, the numbers revealed a striking pattern. The RAF had remained operational at a level that surprised even its own group commanders. Several squadrons, expected to be depleted, had managed to sustain near-full patrol strength through repeated engagements. It was not simply a matter of resilience, it was evidence of an adaptive capability that German intelligence had failed to predict. The Luftwaffe's pre-battle assessments assumed that British maintenance capacity would buckle under sustained attack. Instead, ground crews had demonstrated an ability to improvise, salvage, and repair that extended the operational life of Fighter Command's diminishing assets far beyond the calculations made in Berlin. The events at Hawkinge became part of this broader reality. The engineering officer, after confirming the integrity of the repair, submitted a carefully worded entry in the station's engineering log. It avoided explicit reference to the unofficial nature of the work but acknowledged the emergency reinforcement of structural component using available materials. Such phrasing became common across No. 11 Group, precise enough for internal records, discreet enough to avoid raising formal objections from higher authority. On the squadron level, the impact was felt most immediately in readiness. The Spitfire's continued service meant that pilots maintained their established formations for the next day's sorties. Wingman remained paired. Patrol plans stayed intact. The rhythm of operations endured. Pilots often spoke of the psychological comfort that came from flying familiar aircraft machines whose quirks, tendencies, and responses they understood intimately. Keeping these aircraft serviceable mattered as much to morale as it did to tactics. Across the wider theater, ground crews took note of Hawkinge's example. They were not given official permission to relax regulations, nor did they seek it. Instead, the incident reaffirmed a principle already taking shape across Fighter Command. Responsibility lay with those closest to the machine. If a repair could be made safely and soundly, it should be made. If a component could be salvaged, reworked, or repurposed, it was worth attempting. These decisions were informed not by recklessness but by experience, intuition, and the urgent needs of a nation under threat. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, interpreted the day's events differently. Convinced that the RAF had been severely weakened, German planners believed the assault on London had drawn Fighter Command into a costly defensive battle. They did not realize that the strength they faced that afternoon, including the additional patrols generated by improvised repairs, represented a sustained capability rather than a desperate last effort. This misjudgment would shape their next steps, leading them to shift focus away from fighter bases and toward the capital itself, a strategic decision that allowed Fighter Command crucial time to recover. For Hawk, the aftermath of the day brought neither celebration nor dramatic recognition. The ground crews simply prepared for the next morning. Tools were cleaned, welding gear recharged, salvaged panels sorted by shape and thickness, spare parts scavenged from the remains of shattered aircraft brought in from the surrounding fields. Their work continued in the same disciplined rhythm, strengthened by the knowledge that what they had accomplished under fire had mattered. The reinforced Spitfire stood ready once more, a quiet symbol of British ingenuity, forged in necessity and upheld through skill. And as Fighter Command entered the next phase of the Battle of Britain, the lessons learned from that single forbidden repair resonated across every airfield, shaping a maintenance culture that would sustain Britain through the darkest months of the war. In the days following the 7th of September, Britain entered a new phase of the air war. The Luftwaffe, convinced that Fighter Command was nearing exhaustion, shifted its strategy decisively. Instead of concentrating on airfields and radar stations, German bombers now focused on London and other major cities. This pivot, intended to break civilian morale, inadvertently granted Fighter Command a brief but vital reprieve. For the ground crews at Hawkinge and across No. 11 Group, the change in German targeting did not lessen their workload, but it altered its character. Airfields still faced raids, though less predictably and with slightly reduced frequency. The time bought by the Luftwaffe's strategic error allowed crews to make more deliberate repairs, to rebuild damaged bays, and to restore portions of their tool stores. Yet shortages persisted. The repair performed on the Spitfire at Hawkinge remained emblematic of the ingenuity still required on a daily basis. The engineering officer who had authorized the weld continued to supervise closely. He observed the aircraft's behavior in subsequent sorties, paying particular attention to landing stresses and undercarriage where, after several days of operational flying, he recommended a more thorough inspection. The ground crew dismantled the assembly, examined the reinforced plate, and found that the weld remained intact. Stress marks were present, inevitable given the intensity of operations, but no signs of dangerous deformation appeared. The crew reinstalled the assembly, satisfied that their risky decision had yielded a safe and serviceable modification. Throughout Fighter Command, similar stories emerged. At Kenley, the Hurricane had its wingtip rebuilt from scavenged aluminium sheets fitted with wooden ribs formed from Nissen hut offcuts. At North Weald, a Spitfire flew for a week with a temporary coolant line fashioned from aircraft-grade tubing, originally intended for a different model. At Biggin Hill, electricians repaired shattered control panels using resistors and switches stripped from damaged training aircraft. These acts did not merely maintain operational strength, they represented a collective assertion that the RAF would not be worn down through attrition alone. Often fragile in wartime, found unusual reinforcement through these successes. Crews took pride in seeing their work endure the stresses of combat. Pilots, aware of the risks but trusting in the skill behind the repairs, flew with renewed confidence. This trust between aircrew and ground crew, rooted in shared purpose and strengthened by repeated demonstrations of capability, became one of Fighter Command's quiet advantages. It fostered a unity that no amount of bombing could dislodge. Meanwhile, Fighter Command's leadership recognized the significance of the moment. Although no formal policy endorsed unofficial repairs, group commanders privately acknowledged that rigid adherence to regulation was no longer compatible with the demands of the battle. Briefings circulated that emphasized operational discretion. For engineering officers, carefully phrased guidance that encouraged initiative without overtly challenging Air Ministry doctrine. It was a subtle but meaningful shift. The system began to adapt to the realities faced by those on the ground. As the Luftwaffe intensified its night bombing campaign against London, the role of ground crews gained even greater prominence. Night operations placed additional stress on aircraft, longer sorties, reduced visibility, and the increasing need for instrument reliability. Ground crews worked by shielded lamps, their tools casting small shadows across the surfaces of aircraft awaiting inspection. Each machine was checked meticulously, exhaust stubs tightened, magnetos tested, gyro instruments calibrated, and oxygen systems flushed. Even so, shortages meant that perfection was unattainable. Crews compensated through skill, experience, and a growing mastery of improvisation. The reinforced Spitfire continued to fly. It participated in defensive patrols over Kent, escorted bombers on limited offensive sweeps across the Channel, and joined interceptions during the early stages of the Blitz. Its performance remained reliable, a testament to the judgment exercised on that September afternoon. In time, the weld would be replaced through a more formal repair at a maintenance unit. But by then the aircraft had flown dozens of sorties that might otherwise have been lost. By late September, intelligence and operational patterns made it clear the RAF had survived the most dangerous phase of the Battle of Britain. Fighter Command, though worn and stretched, remained intact. Its ability to field effective defensive patrols, enabled in part by improvised repairs, helped discourage the Luftwaffe from returning to a concentrated assault on airfields. The German belief that the RAF was on the verge of collapse proved mistaken. For the ground crews, the aftermath of these weeks left a deeper legacy. Their actions demonstrated that technical skill, when combined with sound judgment and quiet resolve, could influence the trajectory of a national struggle. They did not seek recognition. Their work was not publicized. Their names seldom entered the official histories, but within the RAF, the significance of their contribution was unmistakable. The repaired Spitfire remained a symbolic reminder not of rule-breaking, but of measured courage applied through craftsmanship. It stood for the thousands of decisions made away from the spotlight, on open airfields under threat, where Britain's fate rested not only in the air but on the ground, in the hands of men who refused to let circumstances dictate defeat.